That day, at a crowded birthday party for their nephew, Mr. Tom sat quietly at a corner of the table. The room was filled with laughter, the lights were bright, everyone shook hands happily, everyone had something to tell, someone to talk to. But for nearly an hour, no one really looked into his eyes and asked how he was doing. He still smiled, still nodded politely, still picked up his glass when someone knocked it, but his heart was empty. The party ended, but he did not remember any of the content of the story. He only felt that his steps as he left were as light as air, but his heart was as heavy as a stone. On the way home, Mr. Tom wondered why he was so tired when no one treated him badly. Everything is still the same, maybe only he is different. From that moment, he began to listen to himself more. He realized that there are times when visiting others does not bring joy, but is only a habit, an invisible obligation. And he wondered, am I living too much for others? Not everyone understands that. And even he himself thought he was being selfish when he started gradually refusing invitations. But then he realized that it was not separation, but a necessary journey to retain the truly important things. It's not that he doesn't want to connect, but he wants to connect more sincerely with his emotions and strength. After many months of quietly observing himself, Mr. Tom realized that the reason why he no longer wanted to visit as much as before did not lie in his age, but in the change in the way he viewed relationships and the value of time. It is a gentle but profound transformation, and perhaps anyone turning 70 will feel this in their own way. Below are 6 reasons that Mr. Tom realized. 6 things that not only help him understand himself better, but also help him find peace in the way he lives and how to maintain relationships with others. Reason 1, spend energy on connections that really matter. When he was young, Mr. Tom almost never refused a meeting, whether it was a small party at a neighbor's house, an old class reunion, or simply a morning coffee without a clear purpose, he fully participated. He used to think that constant presence was the best way to maintain relationships. But now, every time he prepares to go somewhere, he has to sit and rest for a long time to regain energy, both physically and mentally. Driving across the city, holding long conversations, having to listen to things that aren't really close to him, all made him feel exhausted and not as excited as before. One afternoon, he received an invitation to attend the death anniversary of an old friend. At first, he planned to leave out of politeness, but while preparing his clothes, he suddenly stopped. He asked himself, do I really want to come, or am I just doing this because I'm afraid of making others sad? That question made him sit quietly for a long time, looking through the window, where the afternoon sunlight was shining down on newly blooming orchid pots. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to say no to an invitation without feeling guilty. From that moment, Mr. Tom began to rearrange the relationships in his life. He realized that there were people he met often, but could not truly share with. On the contrary, there are people who rarely talk, but just a short call is enough to warm his heart. He no longer tries to keep people close, but only keeps those who make his heart feel at peace. For him, those are the people that after meeting, he feels relieved, listened to, and can be himself without trying. Choosing to be deeply attached to a few genuine relationships did not make him feel lonely. On the contrary, he found himself living more fully. Instead of spreading his energy over dozens of meetings each month, he chooses just a few people. But each conversation is a time when the heart is nourished. For him, it's no longer about socializing, it's about real connection. Reason 2, stay away from unnecessary stress and drama. For a while, Mr. Tom still tried to keep the habit of going to a few relatives' houses every weekend. Those were meetings where he was used to not talking much, just listening. But what made him tired was not his silence, but what he had to hear. The stories that go around and around about someone just buying a new house, this person's child getting promoted, that person's husband having an affair, the small but cutting criticism, The laughter that does not carry sympathy, but a kind of competition wrapped in a veneer of politeness. He often comes home in silence, doesn't turn on the radio, doesn't turn on the TV, just pours a cup of hot tea and sits watching his shadow fall on the tile floor. He wondered why he felt so empty after each visit. Then one day he realized the simple thing. He was pushing himself into meetings that no longer made him feel at peace. Even though people had done nothing wrong, their presence was no longer benign to his soul. When he was young, he thought that maintaining relationships with everyone was a sign of generosity and maturity. But then he understood. True maturity is when we know how to choose who can enter our quiet zone. He began to refuse invitations that made him hesitant, not because he was angry with anyone, but because he no longer wanted to waste precious energy on conversations that made his heart heavier. Instead, he found soothing spaces, a morning reading books at the local library, an afternoon listening to the guitar in the park, or simply a few idle stories with the flower seller in the alley. Small pieces, but enough to make him smile when he returned home. He realized that he did not need many relationships, much less relationships associated with stress and awkwardness. What he needed was serenity, and he chose to preserve it as a sacred thing in his old age. Reason 3. Find comfort in familiar space. One windy winter afternoon, Mr. Tom received an invitation to the house of an acquaintance who had just moved to the neighborhood. He was not very close, but out of politeness and because he had always been a person who was soft-hearted towards sincere invitations, he accepted. When we arrived, the house was spacious and luxurious. Modern music played non-stop. People gathered in groups and chatted loudly. They talked about stocks, travel plans, and expensive dishes in places he had never heard of. He sat there politely smiling and nodding, but his heart felt like he was standing outside a room that he didn't have the key to actually enter. On the way home, the thick coat was not enough to keep me warm as the thought of returning to my familiar small house. The house where he knows every creaking sound of the wooden stairs, every familiar glass on the shelf, where he can turn on trin music just enough to hear, brew a pot of tea to the right taste, and sit in a chair next to the window where the afternoon sunlight often visits. He realized that that space was not only a place to live, but also a place for him to breathe a sigh of relief, not having to try to become anyone. When he was young, he liked to explore, liked to change places and like new things. But the older he gets, the more he understands that familiarity is not boring, but a place of peace for the soul. His house is nothing special, but it gives him a feeling that no other space out there can compare. Freedom. Freedom to be silent when you want, to speak when you need to think without fear of being interrupted, to live without having to play a role. From then on, he no longer felt like he was lazy to go somewhere, as others said, but he felt like he was living more correctly, closer to himself. He still receives people, but in an environment he feels comfortable with. A few close friends came to visit, sipping hot tea with him, listening to the sound of leaves falling on the porch. No need to say much, no need to create an atmosphere. Because at this age, he understands comfort doesn't come from somewhere luxurious, but from somewhere that allows us to be ourselves. Reason 4, prioritize quality over quantity in relationships. There was a time when Mr. Tom's phone kept ringing. His phone book is a page long, with groups of friends chatting from morning to night, coffee dates, class meetings, parties, club activities, and even social calls just to keep in touch. He used to see that as a form of success, that he was someone who was remembered, who was greeted, who was invited. But gradually he began to realize something strange. The more meetings he had, the less he felt like he was truly connecting. He talked a lot, laughed a lot, but there were times in the middle of a crowded party table, he felt like he was sitting alone. One day he pulled out his phone and quietly reviewed each name in his contacts. There were names he hadn't spoken to in 5 years. There are people who only contact when they need help. There were also people he had never really felt moved when facing them. He started deleting it, not because he was angry with anyone, but because he wanted to feel better. And when the calls became less frequent, he realized what he really needed was not a large social circle, but a few people close enough to be able to call in the middle of the night and just say, "I'm tired," without any further explanation. From then on, Mr. Tom no longer followed the pressure to maintain all relationships. He doesn't try to answer enough, appear consistently, or maintain a friendly image. He is selective. There is an old friend who we studied together in high school and now lives not far away. He sometimes stops by to bring a bag of boiled potatoes or a pot of homemade ginger tea. They didn't talk about current events or vacation plans, just sat quietly, occasionally sharing an old story and then laughing. Such encounters, although rare, are fulfilling, like a deep sleep. Mr. Tom realized that at this age, friendship does not need to be frequent or loud. Just thinking about each other makes my heart feel warm. And when we meet again, it's not to tell us what we've done, where we've gone, what we've achieved, but to sit together for a while and feel at peace. It was the kind of friendship that wasn't much, but was more precious than anything he'd ever had in the years full of people, but absent of heart. Reason 5, change priorities and look deeper inward. For a long time, Mr. Tom always felt like he had to be somewhere. Whether it's neighborhood group meetings, healthcare classes, or exchanges organized by the Elderly Association, he always tries to fully participate. Not because he liked it, but because he was afraid that others would think he was backward, isolated, or sad and lonely. But the more he traveled and the more people he met, the more he felt. He was far from himself. Repeated stories, forced laughter, and social interactions made him more tired than excited. Sometimes he sat in the middle of a large group of people, and his mind was busy thinking about the potted plants on the porch that had not yet been watered, or the book he was reading on the night table. Then one morning, without anyone's invitation, without an appointment, without the phone ringing, he woke up early, opened the window to welcome the morning sun, and suddenly breathed out a long, strangely relieved breath. That day he didn't do much. Just make a pot of tea, turn a few pages of a book, go to the back garden to pull weeds, then sit idly watching the sparrows fly back and forth over the fence. But when dusk fell, he felt it had been a full day, full in a way that previous crowded days never brought. From then on, he began to slow down. But he never felt slow. He had time to reflect on the past, on the unfinished dreams, on the small joys he had overlooked because he was too busy having to be present. He wrote his diary again for the first time in decades. Writing is not to tell anyone, but to understand yourself better. He walked regularly every morning, not to exercise, but to see the morning dew on the leaves, to hear the silent world. He rediscovered his old hobbies, pencil drawing, writing poetry, listening to classical music. Not to prove anything, but to calm my heart down, become deeper, more real. Mr. Tom no longer sees meetings as a sign of vitality, but sees silence as a space for the soul to bloom. At this age, he no longer needs to assert who he is to the world. He just needs to wake up every day, feel at peace, still want to listen, and life, although not brilliant, is still flowing quietly and meaningfully. Reason 6, understand that true friendship does not require frequent meetings. Mr. Tom has an old friend named Khan, who was his teammate when he was young. After the war, each person had their own place. Life took different paths. When they were healthy, the two men often arranged to meet once a month, sometimes drinking tea, sometimes just walking around the lake and talking about a few old stories. But then Khan moved back to his hometown to live with his children and grandchildren, while Tom remained in the city. At first, he felt lacking. There were Sunday mornings when he sat alone at a familiar restaurant. Looking at the empty chair opposite him, he felt a sense of loss. But as time passed, he began to understand that not all valuable relationships need to be maintained by constant presence. Even though they didn't meet, he and Khan still wrote handwritten letters to each other, sometimes just a few lines telling the story of the orange tree in the backyard starting to bear fruit, or a poem he happened to read and remembered his soulmate. Every time he received a letter, he opened it slowly like opening a gift, read each word carefully, and then left it there on his desk as a silent presence of long-standing friendship. He realized that there are people who do not need to appear often in daily life, but just mentioning their names warms his heart. There are friendships that do not need constant communication, do not need to update every small change, but still maintain a silent, strong bond. That is the kind of connection that is not measured by the number of times we meet, but by wordless sympathy, by knowing that no matter where or when, the other person still thinks of you respectfully. Sometimes people ask him, "It's been a long time since I've seen you gather with your friends?" He just smiled and didn't explain, because he understands that just because we rarely meet each other doesn't mean we have fewer friends. There are relationships that do not fade even though they are absent, and there are relationships that, even though they are close, still make our hearts feel distant. You don't need to prove it to anyone. True friendship, according to him, is when people still keep a small corner in their hearts for each other, no matter how many different directions each person's life has taken. Looking back on his journey, Mr. Tom does not see himself becoming as cold or distant as he once feared. On the contrary, he feels like he is living more truly than ever. No more appearing just to please someone. No more having to force a smile during meetings that leave you feeling empty. No longer having to maintain relationships that the heart has stopped feeling close to. Instead, he chose mindfulness. Select connections that truly bring peace. Appreciate the people who stay by your side with understanding, not with the number of meetings. Old age, for him, is no longer a period to preserve all relationships, but to retain something worthy of accompanying me in the remaining silence of my life. A cup of tea, an old friend, a handwritten note, or just your own presence in a familiar space, all are enough to make a meaningful day. And if you, the person watching this video, have also felt tired after times of having to be present, ever returned home feeling lost, ever wondered if it was wrong that you just wanted to be alone more, then I hope you know that you are not alone. There are many people like Tom, and perhaps even you, who are learning to choose, learning to listen to themselves, and living more gently every day. If today's story touched you in any way, leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts, feelings, or simply something you learned from Tom's journey. Don't forget to press like video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notification bell to continue to accompany us in the next stories, where simplicity, sincerity, and compassion are always the most appreciated things. Thank you for listening. See you again in the upcoming stories.